I've called this What's Kosher Anyway. And this is more going to be um, kind of a high level look at what kinds of things are kosher and what it means, um, rather than enabling anybody to actually keep kosher, because that's mostly not a goal for Mahar folks anyway, which is fine. Um, but to kind of clarify terms, maybe explain or talk about weird little things you might have wondered, and to talk about things that get called kosher that maybe would surprise you, or that you haven't thought of as being kosher in the same way as other things. So I always have a goals section, and we'll define and understand the general meaning of what kosher is and how that's different from kashrut or keeping kosher, and what glatt kosher means. Um, Identify what glatt kosher really means as opposed to how it's used by a lot of folks. Identify different things that have traditionally been put into kosher, non-kosher categories, because it can be surprisingly broad. Examine a broad set of examples of what those things might be, and what can unmake something, make something not make something kosher. Understand what a hechsher is, and you've got to get the ch in it. It's hechsher. Understand the effects of kosher and non-kosher items on Jewish community life and how that affects humanistic Jews. So there's the reality is we navigate in a broader Jewish world, and navigating in a broader Jewish world the way we do, sometimes kashrut does actually affect how we move through that, world. And then we'll answer your questions, right? So I did an Ask Me Anything kind of a thing a few weeks ago. We're not going to do a full-fledged Ask Me Anything, but things will come up as we go through. We can answer some of the questions. Are not goals, not have us all start keeping kosher. That's not a goal. In an hour and a half, I couldn't possibly give you enough information if you really wanted to do it anyway, but that's not the goal for most of us. It's more knowing things we didn't know before, and maybe knowing a little bit more about what makes it all so complicated in other settings, large Jewish community settings, things like that. So we won't understand all the ins and outs of any area of keeping kosher, and we won't go deep into the weeds on especially complicated issues. There's a whole lot of stuff I could have put in, and we'd never get past the topic of food. But I wanted to make sure we talked about other things, so we're not going to, this is not, there are better places to go if you really, really, really want to get into the weeds on exactly how things work. So we're after basic functional literacy on what the word kosher means and how that affects the broader Jewish world and how we navigate it. That's really what we're after. So then what's kosher anyway? Like, what does this word mean? Where does it come from? And so the word kosher is actually the Ashkenazi pronunciation for the Hebrew word kasher. It should be said up front that American Jews are mostly completely non-reflectively Ashkenazi and don't even know necessarily that there are other ways of doing things. That's just the fact of the matter. We're not all that great at acknowledging that actually conservative synagogues and Reform synagogues and most humanistic synagogues are really Ashkenazi-oriented synagogues. So the modern Hebrew pronunciation is kasher instead of kosher. The basic meaning of the word is fit or suitable. So it can mean fitness for a specific purpose. And now I've just said it like a lawyer, right? It's capable of being used for a specific task or function. It can also mean physical fitness. So there's a business in Israel named Kosher Matchil Kan. Fitness starts here, right? So kasher, kosher really means fit. Not holy, not pure, not clean, but fit for the specific purpose it's being used for. So kashrut is the term for the Jewish legal requirements for food. You don't use it for non-food items. So we'll see that Torah scrolls can be kosher, but kashrut doesn't apply to Torah scrolls because they're not food. There are certain kinds of materials you can and can't use in traditional Jewish law for candles. None of that has anything to do with kashrut because we don't eat those. So when we say kashrut, we're really only talking about food. Kosher or kasher as a category applies to lots of other things. And then the opposite of kasher depends on what you're talking about. So if you're talking about most objects in our world that could somehow qualify as being kosher or non-kosher, if it's not fit for its purpose, it's called pasul, which means unfit or disqualified. For food, and only food, the term that you use is trefa, which functionally for us most of the time means not kosher. But it literally means torn. And it comes out of a biblical passage that talks about how you're not supposed to eat trefa, meat found kind of just lying on the side of the road that maybe a predator killed or something like that. You're supposed to, according to the Bible, not eat those things. So that term, trefa, which you've probably heard in Yiddish as treif, there is actually a podcast out of Canada, a left-wing Jewish podcast called Treif, the Treif podcast. Trefa, this idea of tearing gets applied to non-kosher food generally. Food doesn't get called pasul, it doesn't get called unfit or disqualified very much. It gets called trefa colloquially. So that's what you'll hear people say treif, and treif can mean frog's legs, which are not kosher, but treif could also mean this animal that otherwise would be kosher has a defect and therefore it's treif, it's been torn, it's not fit for use as food. Okay, so kosher or kasher versus pasul, which is unfit or disqualified, trefa, which is food you shouldn't eat under the rules of kashrut, and then kashrut is the rules for food, and everything else is not really called that. It has its own, they'll have their own terms. So kosher as a category, there are lots of specific items in traditional Jewish life that are kosher or not kosher, but not everything in the world gets kosher or non-kosher as a description. So things that we think of pretty routinely, people will think of as being kosher or not kosher. Food and drink are obviously the big ones, but it applies to cooking utensils and flatware and plates and cups and pots and pans and sinks and ovens and refrigerators and kitchen appliances, right? The things that are connected to food kind of logically for a lot of people get the kosher, non-kosher label. Soaps are also an example. Then there are things that don't necessarily come to mind right away. Soap, sponges, towels, Torah scrolls to fill in clothing, tzitzit, the fringes on prayer shawls. You should not call a talit a prayer shawl because that's not actually what it's for. Shofarot, which are shofars, mikvahot, the mikvahs, the ritual baths, they're not baths really, but ritual baths. If you construct it wrong, it's not kosher. Shabbat and Hanukkah candles, for that matter, menorahs, can be not kosher. And there are lots of things that just don't fall into the category. Books are not kosher or non-kosher, unless it's a Torah scroll. Cars are not kosher or non-kosher. There is not a, this is not fit for use kind of car in Jewish law. Roofing tiles, right? I'm naming kind of ridiculous things so you can see most things in the world really don't get kosher, non-kosher as a distinction for them. Kosher doesn't equal ritual purity. So there's an entire system in Jewish law of ritual purity. Things are called tahor, ritually pure, or tameh, ritually impure. Ritual's not the right word, but it's what English gives us. There are rules of family purity, and people can be tahor and tameh, and their clothing can be tahor and tameh. They can be ritually pure or impure. They can carry impurity and transmit it, and that's separate from being kosher or not kosher. because things that can be kosher or non-kosher can be pure or impure. Things that aren't subject to the rules of kashrut can also be pure or impure. So they can overlap. If you were to take a pig and slaughter it on the altar of the temple in Jerusalem when the temple stood, you make the altar pasul, disqualified, and tameh, ritually impure. Some things have to be made both before you can use them. So metal and glass plates and utensils, if you buy them at Target or whatever, and you are somebody who follows the rules of kashrut, of kosher food strictly, you are going to make sure that they are koshered, right? Fit for use for food, but you're also going to take them to a mikvah. And you're going to immerse all of that stuff in a mikvah, and you will say a blessing associated with doing that. So Corelware, glass, not ceramics. Ceramics don't fall under this. You buy a new set of forks, knives, flatware for the table. People will take those to a mikvah and immerse them in a mikvah because there are just separate rules in the Talmud about what you do with utensils. It's not really useful to start scratching at exactly why that is. It's that way because the rabbis decided it's that way. There's no biblical anything for backing a lot of this stuff up, but the rabbis decided that there was, and they came up with rules. I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes the rabbis just came up with rules. But the systems don't always overlap. So food doesn't really get bound up in this ritual purity stuff. People aren't kosher or non-kosher. You're not supposed to eat people, but not because people are kosher or non-kosher. For food purposes, it's a different rule. But there are laws regarding ritual purity for people. So there are things like the idea of the zav, somebody who has some kind of thing coming out of them, menstruating, or women who recently gave birth to children also fall into a category of ritual impurity. Associated clothing, if you come in contact with a dead body, there's a category of ritual impurity. None of that stuff is about kosher or non-kosher. It's just about the ritual state of the person as eligible for participating in broader religious life. So kashrut and the rules of being kosher or non-kosher for all this other stuff out there is separate from ritual purity, but there's some interlocking stuff. So because that's a lot, we should sum up a little bit. There are rules for the many things that can be kosher or not kosher. It's not just food. It's always about whether that thing is suitable for use under Jewish law. Not about whether it's healthy, not about whether it's clean necessarily, but just does it fit the requirements for traditional Jewish law. Those rules aren't necessarily about ritual purity, but there's overlap between the purity system and the rules for things being kosher or not kosher. Okay, so I said I'd talk about what glatt kosher is right up front. I said we will, but it's only about food, so we're not putting it here. We're going to talk about it later. But before we move on to all that other stuff, questions so far, because I know I zoomed through a bunch of things, but it'll make more sense when we actually look at specific things. Jack.
Just to make sure I'm clear, illustrate that kosher means fit. So when something is labeled kosher for Passover, that means it is fit for Passover use because it complies with the specific rules that govern food at Passover, for example.
Right. And if it's kosher for Passover, it's kosher all the rest of the time. But this has all kinds of strange results, like If you go to a grocery store right now, you can buy matzah that's not kosher for Passover. Because the rest of the year they make matzah because they know people make matzah balls and things like that the rest of the year, but it's not kosher for Passover matzah. It's not produced with the same strictures. So it can be kosher and not kosher for Passover, even when it's matzah. Okay, so we'll talk about glatt when we get there, because that's definitely a food thing, and it's misunderstood a lot of the time. So what's treif? What's glatt? What's a hechsher? Do you even speak English anymore, Rabbi? These are all valid questions. I'm not always sure I'm speaking English to my kid, but that's just because he doesn't listen. Okay, so kashrut, also known as kosher food, and I know the text is probably small, but I promise I'll talk through all of it. So we know a lot of the broader categories of what's kosher for food just by kind of being in the American Jewish ecosystem, right? And I said it's mostly Ashkenazi and really unself-aware of that fact. But just being around, you kind of pick up rules. So, the jokes are always, there's no pork, right? Can't eat a ham sandwich. Rabbi, how'd that ham sandwich taste? Okay. No pork, no shellfish, mostly no bugs. There's like a asterisk on that we'll talk about. Kosher meat is a thing. It's salty a lot of the time because it has to have the blood drained out of it, and it's much more expensive, in part because of draining the blood, in part because of the rules for treifa that mean you slaughter an animal and discover afterward that, okay, that's not kosher. And maybe somebody told you Hebrew National isn't really kosher as well. So we'll come back to that, because depending on who you ask, it's not kosher anymore. No cheeseburgers, because milk and meat can't go together. No ham sandwiches, because ham. No chicken parmesan. No milk and meat together at all. So we'll talk about why no chicken parmesan, because that's not obvious when you first look at the rules. Kosher wine exists and is generally not as good. We'll talk about why that is. No bread on Passover, and maybe no beans or rice. Sephardic communities, frequently beans and rice on Passover are fine. There are a lot of people, when they are Ashkenazi, some kind of European Jewish, and they move to Israel, very quickly drop the no beans and rice thing for Passover. But no beans and rice also, really strictly speaking, means that people who keep kosher for Passover don't eat peanut butter on Passover either. You know that there's something about people having lots of sets and plates and lots of pots and pans because you need different ones for Passover. You don't really need different ones for Passover, but you do have to go through a hassle to take your regular ones and make them work for Passover. Sometimes you know that your oven has Shabbat mode, or a little like heating compartment in the back that retains heat for Shabbat, and your manual may even say talk about Shabbat mode. And sometimes refrigerators have them too. But refrigerators is not about kashrut, it's the light bulb. And if you've had kosher marshmallows and kosher jello, you probably think this is not as good as the real stuff. There's reasons for all of this. We won't go into all of the reasons, but there are reasons for all of this. So what's going on with as much of it as we can talk about? So I have written here, Jewish law is a confusing mess on what is meat and what isn't, unless you know that it's actually not that big of a mess. So let's talk turkey. We're going to talk about turkeys in a second. So meat for kashrut purposes. Animals that live on land or fly that aren't arthropods or other creeping things, so snakes, lizards, those are meat for kashrut purposes, and that look like the kinds of animals that might have been used as sacrifices at the temple. So we're really talking about birds and livestock. Those are things that qualify as meat for purposes of the rules of kashrut. And there are limits on what kind of meat are considered kosher, right? So we kind of know, you probably know something about chewing cud and cloven hooves. So cattle, sheep, goats, lambs, deer, gazelle all qualify as kosher. Oxen do not. They don't have cloven hooves. Horses do not. They don't have cloven hooves. Pigs do not, because they don't chew their cud. There's nothing particularly special about pigs being unclean or something. It's just they don't chew their own cud. Camels chew cud, but they actually don't have hooves. I don't know if you knew this. They have toes. Bears, dogs, cats, right? Humans are not for consumption, but kashrut doesn't apply to humans. You don't eat people because you don't eat people. Birds. So at the temple, people might sacrifice sheep or goats or cattle, but they might also offer a pheasant or quail or doves or something like that. Pigeons. I don't think they were doing like pigeons like New York City pigeons, but pigeons. So old world birds, we'll talk about that a little bit. Old world birds that aren't scavengers or birds of prey of particular sorts are kosher, but so chicken, pheasant, quail, but not owls or eagles or vultures or hawks. Turkeys really shouldn't be kosher because they're not old world birds, at least not the Thanksgiving turkeys that we're accustomed to. Turkeys are not really, they really shouldn't be kosher. But there's an odd historical quirk. People got confused, in large part by the name. Rabbis got confused and decided that they were kosher. There's an article out there on the internet that sort of explains how this happened. The name for a turkey in Hebrew is tarnagol hodu. So tarnagol is the Hebrew word for chicken. Tarnagol, it's chicken. Hodu is the Hebrew word for turkey, like the country. So you know what happened, right? Somebody said it's a turkey, and somebody went, hodu? Oh, it's a Turkish bird. Fine. That's how turkey was determined to be kosher. Was people got confused by the name, and here we are. So turkeys in Hebrew are really named for the country Turkey, not Turkey the bird in exactly the same way. Okay. Things that don't count as meat are the kinds of animals not offered at the temple. Creeping things, arthropods, worms, snakes, lizards, all are not kosher. The Torah mentions one or two kinds of locusts or grasshoppers that are things that are allowed to be eaten, but the species are unknown, so really nobody does that. They weren't offered as sacrifices at the temple, so the same rules don't apply if we knew what they were, but functionally it just takes arthropods off the menu, which I wasn't all that interested in eating arthropods, so okay. Things from the water, fish aren't meat because you weren't going to offer that at the temple because the temple wasn't next to the water, and it just they don't count. So fish have to, according to the Torah, have fins and scales to be considered kosher. Depending on the Jewish community, sharks and sturgeon sometimes are considered to count as kosher. Sharks don't have scales, right? They have this kind of rough skin. Sometimes people decide that that's good enough. Sturgeon don't have traditional overlapping scales the way a lot of fish do. They're more like plates and they don't quite overlap, but the conservative movement in particular swings back and forth between whether they think sturgeon is kosher or not. So it's up for grabs. So the not meat thing matters because you have to worry about dairy food, right? So it wouldn't really matter that it's meat, except that there are rules about dairy, so you've got to kind of balance the two. And all of this balancing that gets done happens because the Torah has some stuff in it, and the rabbis grabbed onto that stuff and ran it farther down the line. So dairy is a separate category because the Torah makes it one, and the rabbis just double down on it. So we know that Kashrut says you don't mix milk and meat. So how do you know what counts as meat? My hypothesis is really temple sacrifices. We'll get there. How do you know what counts as meat? Because temple sacrifices So we already know ham sandwiches aren't kosher. We already know lobster rolls aren't kosher. And we know that cheeseburgers aren't kosher because we've been told that cheeseburger isn't kosher, even though what the Torah actually says is don't boil a calf in its mother's milk. The rabbis take this rule and they stretch it. And then they stretch it, and then also they happen to say, but it's been in the Torah the whole time. So there we are. It's a little weird. So what's wrong with chicken parmesan or turkey and mashed potatoes with butter? Because if the Torah's rule is you don't boil a calf in its mother's milk, I don't know if you've looked at a bird recently, but they don't have milk. So how does that work? So what's wrong with chicken parmesan or any of this other stuff? Basically, the rabbis decided. So in the case of meat of a kosher animal, in the milk of a kosher animal, you can't cook it together. And Rabbi Akiva says if it's a bird, it's not forbidden in the Torah itself, therefore you can't eat them together. But because we decided you can't eat them together, not because the Torah says anything. So that's kind of where this no chicken parmesan thing is coming from, is the rabbis have these rules and they're trying to figure out what they mean. And the majority opinion very, very early on eventually became, okay, you can't have dairy products with poultry. But eventually it's also clear that some people did it. So Rabbi Akiva here is saying you can't do it, but there's this other rabbi, Yossi Haglili, who says you can. So there are explanations for this. David Kramer, who's a professor of Talmud at JTS, said, why do the rabbis consider poultry to be meat? Because it's not, it doesn't have dairy. So why are we getting this confused? And he says, look, if it tasted like meat, it was meat. Chicken, goat, I mean, that's really his argument, is like chicken kind of texture like goat, texture like that, so it's meat. I think this kind of ignores that the things that the rabbis are saying you can't eat with milk are the kinds of animals that were sacrificed at the temple, because there's not a problem from the rabbi's perspective of putting fish and dairy together. And some fish is not all that different from meat, like, it flakes and all those kinds of things. But we don't really have an answer. There's just this rule sitting in a book from 200 CE, which, I don't know, there's a lot of rules sitting in that book from 200 CE that don't have great explanations. So that's the no chicken parmesan or turkey and mashed potatoes with butter. Do you want to try our cheese plate? Yes or no? If somebody keeps kosher, hard cheeses have traditionally been a problem because hard cheeses are produced with rennet. Rennet comes from the stomach of an animal. And we've actually already seen that the rabbi said, no, you can't do that. You can't combine animal and milk together. That's not good. And they actually come right out and say, nope, you cannot ferment milk in an animal's stomach. And then, right, okay. However, in the US in particular, synthetic rennet is now used, particularly in large scale production. So most hard cheeses in the US are kosher in reality. You don't need a lot of rennet in order to ferment cheese. In order to curdle milk to start to create cheese, you really don't need a lot. The amount that you need is way less than is usually the threshold for something being kosher or not kosher. But the threshold also involves something changing the taste of something, and that's where it kind of falls down. So to sum up, the rabbis aren't zoologists or biologists, and thus they said poultry is like meat, so no chicken parmesan. The rabbis did know how to make cheese, even though they weren't zoologists or biologists. And they did conclude that if an animal product made a dairy product what it was, the dairy product mixed milk and meat and wasn't kosher. And that's how you get the no hard cheese thing until synthetic rennet is developed. That kind of gives you a hint as to how people figure out what is and isn't kosher when you have to take the categories and actually apply them for yourself, as opposed to looking for a label. It's ingredients plus preparation, and especially when the preparation affects the taste. It also tells us that this word treif, that means torn, that indicates that something is not kosher as food, is just a colloquialism, because cheese is not torn from an animal, right? But cheese prepared with rennet is treif. So we can see that the meaning of that word kind of stretches. But the word in its original meaning, treif, actually does matter. It means torn, and an animal that's in bad physical condition isn't kosher. And this is what gets us to the word glot kosher. So glot is actually a Yiddish word that means smooth. And it actually applies to inspecting animal lungs after the animal is slaughtered. If the animal would be kosher, but upon feeling the lungs, the butcher finds adhesions or nodules, the shochet, the slaughterer, not really the butcher, but the slaughterer finds adhesions or nodules on the outside of the lungs, they usually consider the lungs to be torn, and thus the entire animal is considered treif, and you can't use it for kosher food. It's not fit for kosher food. The idea being, if you see adhesions or nodules on the outside, it means that there's unhealed tissue in the lung, and they actually have small perforations, and so the animal is physically imperfect and can't be used for kosher food. Because the Orthodox Union really kind of oversees almost all kosher certification in the US, basically all kosher meat in the US is glot kosher. Not all meat in the world that's kosher is glot kosher, because it doesn't apply to all poultry for some Sephardic Jews. But again, in the US, almost everything is really run by Ashkenazic Jews. So in reality, meat in the US is glot kosher, but in Israel, it might not be, because not everything is inspected. So then this extra level of strictness about the lungs of an animal, which is a rule that developed in like the 1500s. It doesn't date back to like the ancient rabbis. They didn't check the lungs, apparently. Glot is sometimes used to mean strict or completely. So you will find folks running around who say that you can be glot secular, totally secular. And you will see people say glot kosher means really, really, really kosher. But kosher is like a yes-no category. So glot kosher doesn't mean especially kosher. It's got a really technical application, and people have taken the meaning and pulled it farther out. So there are a few Mahar members who talk about things being glot kosher, meaning completely, totally, super duper, glot secular, meaning super duper secular in every respect. That's a meaning built off the misunderstanding of what glot means in the setting of kosher food. So if all of this is bugging you, you should check your lettuce. And if you think I'm kidding, I'm not. You're not supposed to eat bugs if you keep kosher. And modern technology means that you are somehow, we've got to work this out. Somehow, the rules for Kashrut didn't change, didn't get more strict, and yet all the practices got more strict. Because now we have light boards. So people who keep kosher, many of them now own a bug checker max or some comparable light board, right? You can use one that you get from a camera supply store or a medical supply company for reading x-rays. And no kidding, one piece of lettuce at a time goes onto the light board and is checked for bugs. You get rid of all the bugs and then you can use the piece of lettuce. This company's website actually says not just lettuce, and they take you to a list of all the things you can use that you can inspect with the Bug Checker Max as a way of selling you the Bug Checker Max. It's just a light board like people use for slides and for x-rays and whatever else. But this is where Kashrut has gone, right? So the thing about Jewish law is the reality is it gets more and more strict as each generation moves along now. And great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, people who lived in Eastern Europe did not have these things. They didn't have the Bug Checker Max. They held stuff up, and if they didn't see any obvious bugs, they used it. So the rules didn't change, but somehow all the rules changed. So this is part of what's going on with Kashrut these days is technology enables more strict following of the rules. The rules don't change necessarily, but you got to buy a Bug Checker Max. So it's very complicated, right? Obviously, it's very complicated. How does a person who wants to keep kosher, like how do they navigate the world? And the answer is that's what certification authorities are for. So that's what a hechsher is for. It's hard to say hechsher, right? So hechsher is the certification that something is kosher, right? It comes out of the Hebrew word kasher. It means certification that a thing is kosher. It's a thing that causes a thing to be viewed as fit for a purpose. There are a bunch of different agencies that do this. Each one has maybe slightly different rules that can matter to different groups of Jews in different ways. So in a given regional Jewish community, the Washington Orthodox rabbis have their own rabbinical council that accepts many, but not every kosher certifying authority. You'll find a different list of acceptable ones in Chicago and a different list of acceptable ones in New York and in Atlanta, and everywhere these Orthodox bodies will recognize a different list of certifying authorities. But about 80% of the stuff out there in stores that people actually consume have one of 5 of these hechshers on them. The Orthodox Union, so the Orthodox Union is like the Society for Humanistic Judaism, but for Orthodox Jews, or the United Synagogue for Conservative Judaism, but for modern Orthodox Jews. So if you see an O or a circle with a U inside of it, that's the Orthodox Union saying this is kosher. There's OK Kosher, which is a circle with a K inside of it. OK stands for Organized Kashrut. So a rabbi in the 1930s created an organization called the Organized Kashrut Laboratories, and they became one of the big places for certifying things as kosher. There's Kof K, the Hebrew letter Kaf, but again, it's American Judaism. Ashkenazim are really influential, so they called it Kof, not Kaf. So it's Kof K. So it'll be the Hebrew letter Kof, which looks like a backwards C, with a K inside of it. Star K, it's a star with a K. I don't know what to tell you, it's a star with a K. And then the Chicago Rabbinical Council, or CRC, it's a triangle with CRC inside of it, 2 lowercase c's and an uppercase R. And that's how you know this is a typo. That's how you know, one, that these are typos because autocorrect kicked in. But when you see a triangle with a CRC, you know it's from the Chicago Rabbinical Council. Most local Orthodox boards of rabbis accept these 5, no questions asked. You walk into an Orthodox synagogue and you're carrying something with OU certification, those local boards of rabbis are going to be fine with it. There are lots of smaller authorities Smaller authorities, not everybody accepts what they do. They don't accept necessarily what they do because there are differences between Chabad Kashrut practices, right? The Lubavitchers have some different rules about Kashrut than do other Hasidic groups or other ultra-Orthodox groups. And so there are differences that matter in these smaller subsets of Orthodox Jewish communities. We're not going to get into that. If you have somebody coming over and they keep kosher and you need to get something for dessert or whatever, you can go to the grocery store, find a thing with a star K and get that. And that's going to be acceptable for that person almost 100% of the time. You can buy food in grocery stores that claims to be kosher and all that's printed on it is a K. There's no circle. There's no kaf around it. There's no star. It's just a K. Lots and lots and lots of people who keep kosher don't trust the K. Just the K all by itself. They don't trust it because there's no organization vetted standing behind it. The manufacturer has kind of decided, maybe they have supervision, but maybe they don't. The manufacturer of the product has decided it's kosher. And so they put a K on it. And you get really weird results. Like, I didn't bring it in with me, but we have a pack of hot dog buns that I bought at Target. The hot dog buns say that they're kosher. They have a K, not in a circle, not in a star, just a K by itself. And it says dairy on hot dog buns. So if you keep kosher and you see a bag of hot dog buns that say K and dairy, you're not going to buy them because you don't trust the K and it says dairy. What are you going to use those hot dog buns for? You can't use them for lobster rolls. That's out. So what are you going to, grilled cheese sandwiches maybe? I guess. It boggled my mind when I saw it because what is the point? So this is a thing that happens. So if you do have somebody coming over or you need to go to somebody's house and you're bringing a thing for dessert because that's what you do, you want to make sure it's not a regular K because somebody who really keeps kosher knows the difference and they're not going to like this. Okay. So we stopped talking, we're talking about milk and meat and we left off parv. And what's a parv? So parv is a Yiddish word that means neutral. It's not milk, it's not meat. You can pair it with either. In modern Hebrew, parv comes in as parva. So you may hear people say parva. You may hear them say parv. You may hear them say parava. Any of these are possible. Eggs are parv. They're not milk, they're not meat. Even though chickens count as meat. The rabbis made these rules. I'm just telling you. Vegetables are parv if you get rid of the bugs. Bread is sometimes parv, right? We talked about hot dog buns made with milk. There are other kinds of breads that are produced with dairy, and those products are not parv, they're dairy. Fish are parv because no one sacrificed fish at the temple, so fish can go with meat and they can go with milk. But then you have to pick, you put in milk or meat plates out if you keep separate plates. So how do I know it's parv? You look for the hechsher. If it's dairy, it's going to say dairy, it'll have a D. If it's parv, it'll say parv, it'll have a P. That's how you figure it out. So general navigation of the world, there's ways of dealing with the fact that the rules are really complex without having to worry about the rules. And the way you do it is you look for one of these organizations' stamp, and then you figure out dairy or parv. Very few of the things that are sold in stores that are outside of the meat section, right? Unrefrigerated things are very likely not going to, if they include meat, they're very unlikely to have a hechsher on them, other than like canned soup in the kosher food section. So Campbell's is not going to be worrying too much about kashrut certification on its meat, right? Don't expect to get kosher Campbell's soup. It's not going to happen. Okay, so that's sort of like scratching the surface on food without getting hopefully too into the weeds, but it's a little in the weeds, I know, whether or not you inspect your weeds for bugs. So questions?
I've got one, I guess.
Okay.
Apropos of modern technology, do you happen to know what the current state of Orthodox rabbinic thinking is about lab-grown meat, where it starts out with just a cell, but ultimately I don't think these are quite marketed yet, but ultimately results in a hamburger or, for that matter, a slab of bacon?
Yeah, so they really haven't decided yet. There are some like kind of opinion papery things out there, but nobody's really made a decision yet. And we know no one has made a decision because if they had, we'd have heard about it. So there are the rabbinic equivalent of think pieces, right? There are articles in journals of rabbinic law that are working through some of the issues, thinking through the issues, trying to figure out what legal categories apply. That's where that process is right now. So Larry, you're unmuted.
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you have any idea, Jeremy, what people pay or what does it cost to kosher a given food? Somebody has to pay for it.
Yeah, the consumer pays for it. So so a company that wants to sell something and have it certified as kosher does pay OU or whoever it is. I don't know what the fees are that they pay, but they pass the cost on to the consumer.
Yeah, but I was wondering if it costs a dime per hamburger or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little more complicated than that, because depending on the food type, OU may insist on having somebody there all the time.
Sure, it would differ.
Yeah. So like the Hebrew National factories that were in the Midwest had full-time rabbis on staff.
I have another question. Maybe I came in late. I'm sorry. Maybe you addressed. So if I have my cow, I've carefully raised my cow, and I take it to be slaughtered and they find it is not kosher, can a Jew sell treif to a non-Jew, or is it total loss? I can sell it.
You can sell it. Yeah. And that's the normal process. So it's very normal for the stockyards that perform kosher slaughter. They also feed the non-kosher animals into the non-kosher supply chain. Roz.
Hi, I live in Kemp Mill, Maryland, or as I call it, Kosher Town, where I lived for 20 years. So I've learned a lot along the way. And this is pre-pandemic, but you'll appreciate this. To get a restaurant sanctified as kosher, you use is it Mashiach?
Mm-hmm. Mashgiach, yeah.
And it's very expensive and very political. And before the pandemic, there was a young guy who keeps kosher, and he thought there were 7 or 8 vegan restaurants in this area, and he thought they all ought to be certified as kosher because it would help the restaurant and it would help all the people who keep kosher. So he got himself certified so that he could charge them a small amount of money and help everybody out, which I thought was like a real mitzvah.
Yeah. So
I don't know what happened since then, but and the other thing that I've learned from all the people I know who keep kosher is not everybody does the same thing.
Yeah, not everybody does the same thing. So There are regional variations on how long you have to wait between milk and meat. For the Dutch, it's an hour. For the Germans, it's 3. For everyone else in the Ashkenazic world, it's 6. But then there are a lot of Germans who say, well, we don't live in Germany anymore, and their practice then moves over to the 6-hour time frame. And the same is true for Dutch Jews. And so there's lots and lots and lots of variation in the Jewish world on all of this stuff. What happened with the Kashrut Authority for the vegan restaurants is it's still around. In fact, in 2019, in 2018 or 2019, the Washington Board of Rabbis every year does a day of study for the rabbis. It's right around Shavuot, so late spring, early summer. And it was actually catered by one of the restaurants, one of the vegan restaurants that was certified by this rabbi. So the authority, the certification authority is still around, still supervising these restaurants, and some of them are very good, and you would not know, but for the fact that the thing in the middle is a bamboo skewer, you would not know that it was not really a chicken wing, for example. So the food is very good at some of them, and they're still doing that work. And it is a combination of political, and we should really be honest here, there are racial aspects to this as well. Because a number of these vegan restaurants are owned by people from Caribbean islands or from Africa, and there is some kind of racial component to the decision to not certify these restaurants. So that's part of it too, unfortunately. So that program is still around. So OMG, oh my goodness, this is Machar, oh my goodness, why do I care? So there are humanistic Jews who keep kosher. Not a lot, but there are some. Some do it so that Jews who keep kosher will eat at their homes. I have to tell you, this is not a straightforward thing. I'll talk about why in a second. Some do it because they find value in the cultural practices. There are humanistic Jews who wear kippot all the time because I'm a Jew, darn it. It doesn't matter that the Guide to Humanistic Judaism that a lot of us got in the mail, that has all the definitions, puts kippot under symbols and says humanistic Jews only wear kippot when they're at non-humanistic synagogues. The reality is not the same as the book. Surprise. Some people do it accidentally, sort of, because they're strictly vegan, but they're probably not taking their plates to the mikvah to immerse them, so they don't really strictly meet all the standards, right? It just is an accidental kind of thing. It should be said, just because you're vegetarian doesn't mean you keep kosher, because if you eat cheese and it's not kosher certified cheese, you've got an issue. If you don't check your eggs for spots, it's not kosher, right? There's more stuff to keeping kosher than saying, okay, I'm going to be a vegetarian, that takes care of it. Doesn't really. So humanistic Jews who keep kosher so that other Jews who keep kosher will eat with them should understand that in the world of modern Orthodoxy and off to the farther right in the Orthodox world, they also care about whether the person they're eating with observes Shabbat and purity laws, family purity laws. And if they don't observe them well enough, they won't eat at their homes. So this is not the unity building exercise that it might seem to be, because there are going to be a lot of people who say, I'm sorry, you're just not observant of Jewish law enough for me to eat at your home. So this is of limited utility. I feel like it should be said. In the broader Jewish world, there's something that a number of us call the frommest common denominator. That in a lot of Jewish community settings, it's not a race to the bottom on Kashrut, it's a race to the top. that having higher standards of kashrut at their functions is most inclusive. That's the perception, because it means everybody, i.e. the very Orthodox, can attend our APAC thing, our federation thing, whatever it is. If we get the stuff with the certification from the most strict kashrut authorities, it's fine, everybody can do it. Unless you have ethical objections to how the local kashrut authorities behave, in which case you don't want to eat the food because you've got a different objection, right? So it's a frummest common denominator, not a, it's not as inclusive maybe as it seems like it could be. But this has an effect on Reform and Reconstructionist congregations who sometimes will concede to Orthodox hashgacha. This is the term for oversight. So the person who does the oversight is a mashgiach, which is the overseer, and hashgacha is the oversight. So there are some Reform and Reconstructionist congregations who say, okay, fine, kosher kitchens, we're going to allow the Orthodox mashgiach to come in and oversee everything in order to cater to that frummest common denominator. That's their decision. That's all I'll say. That's their decision. And you will find in conservative synagogues and Reform and Reconstructionist ones, you will often find a list of what the local Orthodox authority considers to be the acceptable list of kashrut authorities, right? With the star K, and they'll have a list with more than just those 5. So this does have an effect on the broader Jewish world. The increasing strictness of kashrut, it has an effect. And it has an effect on non-Orthodox Jews who otherwise don't follow these rules. And then there's kosher style, right? The kosher style deli is something like cultural kashrut, which means something more like, well, like a New York deli, but not actually kosher, because we know you want a Reuben, and that's got cheese on it, so that's not kosher really. And also, we're like a New York deli, we're kosher style. We don't have ham or bacon or clam chowder. What do you think? We're Philistines, right? So even in Indiana, so my mom's on the call, so she's going to laugh because she knows I'm talking about Shapiro's Deli in Indianapolis. Shapiro's Deli in Indianapolis, which hasn't been an actual kosher deli, it's been kosher style for like 90 years now, doesn't have ham or bacon or clam chowder or any of that stuff, even in Indiana, because they're kosher style. And I think the first time I was there, somebody came in and said, hey, don't you guys have ham sandwiches? And the Shapiro family member who was working behind the counter, had a small fit at the person, because what do you think is going on here? This is, kosher style delis often don't have ham or bacon or clam chowder or shrimp salad or any of that kind of stuff, because there's a kind of a taboo thing that's developed about those foods that makes them not acceptable for kosher style, even when you don't really keep kosher. In fact, I knew an attorney in Indianapolis who kept kosher at home. They didn't keep kosher out. And so they would order bacon at breakfast, and they wouldn't let their kids hear the word bacon. And then when the food came, they'd ask the kids, do you want to try some of that? So their kids didn't know what bacon was. So when they'd go out, they'd try to order, quote, some of that, but they didn't know what it was. So they couldn't order bacon. And they didn't have it at home. So it took a while before these kids figured out that, oh, bacon's called something. It's called bacon. I can order bacon. It's called bacon, right? They would say, I want to get some of that. And the waitress goes, what are you talking about? This was not nice of the parents to do necessarily, but it happened. What about Machar? Obviously, we do not keep kosher, right? But think about the Passover Seder when we do it in person. There's always a request that for the potluck dinner, don't bring stuff that's like obviously bready, right? It doesn't say bready in the announcement, but it says consistent with usual standards for Passover. So don't bring a bread pudding, right? A lot of people will bring matzah mac and cheese rather than actual macaroni and cheese because noodles are leavened and don't count for Passover and things like that. So we actually acknowledge, at least on Passover, that there's an expectation that certain things aren't going to be there. And that's a cultural thing. It's not a religious thing, right? It's Passover. We're not gonna sit around with like loaves of bread on the table. Which I always have to explain to people, like, wait, so do you guys do? And it's like, look, nobody's sitting there eating beans and toast at Passover. So before we get to all the other stuff, because I've lumped all the other stuff behind this slide, any questions about the like firmest common denominator things? Oh, so Larry says, Christians rely on the difference in fleischig and parv as described from Judaism to distinguish fish from other kinds of meat, right? So on Lent, that's sort of where some of this comes from. Some of that's where some of the fish thing comes from. There's also a story that like the Pope was trying to support British fishermen in the Middle Ages and said, everybody eat fish on Friday.
Well, this quote comes from a discussion that says the Lent rules are rooted in Corinthians. I can't find it. Scrolling up to it. So apparently there's a text for Lent. I may be misremembering it.
Well, I don't have my New Testament with me, so I'll have to go look at it.
Well, I just Googled something.
Oh, yeah, I'm in a different room from my New Testament. But my wife's novels are all very nice.
Well, you don't want to have to read all of Corinthians, but
I have
a citation for this.
I have read all of it. It's been a while.
So I wanted to say just a little more in the real world. My grandmother, I think, was in one of the categories you just described. Her father was a shochet. She kept kosher. She knew what she was doing, but she wasn't a fanatic. She wasn't glatt kosher, as we would say.
Right.
She, with us in restaurants, she would always order eggs, even though she knew the kitchen was not kosher.
Yeah.
So she kept kosher at home.
Yeah, there's a lot of, we keep kosher at home and we eat out. The term eating out among people who are otherwise halachically observant is code for we'll go to the Chinese restaurant and get pork fried rice, right?
I doubt that my grandma.
Right, but that's the phrase that's
used. Got it. Yeah.
Jack,
kosher enough.
Yeah, kosher enough. Jack, you've got a virtual hand.
I know this is a big question and you can't go into detail, but what's the degree of overlap between kashrut and halal?
Not huge, actually. This is one of those areas that sometimes gets a little overstated. So the way it really kind of works is that meat that's kosher is almost certainly halal, but the reverse is not true. Because the standards for inspection and slaughter really aren't the same. It's just that kashrut is more strict. So kosher food is almost by default halal, but halal food is not to be assumed to be kosher. So that's the relationship generally. Okay, so what about all the other stuff? Because I talked about other things. I talked about Torah scrolls and mikvahs and menorahs and candles, and so let's talk about all those other things a little bit. And if you were thinking, you said you'd talk about Torah scrolls, where'd that go? All right, already. Let's talk about koshers. Let's talk about Torah scrolls. Torah scrolls, mezuzah scrolls, the scrolls inside of tefillin, the leather boxes with the straps. Less so the Book of Esther and the Megillah scroll. You don't actually have to use a scroll for that. These items are There are rules that determine whether the scrolls are kosher, are fit for use for public Torah reading or fulfilling the commandments for mezuzah or tefillin. The rules are complex. I have, not with me, of course, I didn't bring it with me. I have a book that's about an inch thick, all in Hebrew, with the laws for figuring out how to write a kosher Torah scroll or mezuzah scroll or whatever it is. And the rules deal with the integrity of the parchment, the legibility of the writing. Those are most of them, but it also extends to what you can use to write with. You are not supposed to, according to the rules for writing Torah scrolls, safrut is the term for scribal work. So according to the rules for safrut, you're not supposed to use a pen with a quill with a metal nib for writing a Torah scroll, because the Torah is supposed to be a document of peace, and something with iron is an implement of war. So you can use a papyrus reed, you can use a feather quill. There are some scribes who use gold nibs, particularly for Kabbalistic documents. You can also buy plastic tips to go onto your feather quill so you don't have to cut the quill. There are all kinds of options out there. The rules also extend to the kind of ink that you use, down to how individual letters are formed and whether you formed them correctly, and if you made a mistake, how you corrected the error. So things that you really can't see by looking at the scroll do affect whether the scroll is considered to be kosher. So if the text degrades or the parchment degrades over time, not tie, the incorrect tools were used, or that they were used the wrong way, the thing was written in the wrong order, you have to go one word at a time. You can't do one panel and then backtrack, and you can't go from the bottom to the top. It's supposed to be one word at a time in order, one letter at a time in order. So if you did it in the wrong order, you formed the letters in the wrong order, in theory, you wrote the strokes for the letters not in the right order, although it's not necessarily that strict. You didn't correct mistakes the right way when you made them. You didn't use the right ink. The scribe wasn't sufficiently Torah observant for the people who are going to use the scroll. Are defects that make the scroll not kosher, and therefore the Hebrew for it, pasul, disqualifies the scroll. In addition to just legibility. So a lot of communities will not use a Torah scroll written by scribed by somebody who isn't above their level of observance of Jewish law. There are many women who are now working as scribes. There are lots of synagogues that, particularly the Orthodox ones, that will not use Torah scrolls or the scrolls from mezuzot or any of that, won't use ones written or corrected later in time by women. So who writes it, despite the fact that you may never be able to tell 100 years down the line who wrote the thing, in theory can render a Torah scroll not kosher. Machar has a Torah, so what kind of shape is it in? If we were concerned about having a kosher Torah scroll, we would need to be very concerned about our Torah scroll. So just so that we can I took photos of a couple of spots on the same column of parchment, as it happens. So this larger photo right here, you can see that this was corrected. So this word right here was actually corrected. This one was too, right? You can kind of see the ink is darker here than it is over here, and it's lighter here than it is around it. This letter, this is an aleph, and the one next to it is a vav. These letters would be of great concern for somebody who was worried about this Torah scroll being kosher because the aleph is starting to kind of come apart. This is the same letter as this. And you can see it's not completely intact anymore. Over here, we can see where there was a fix made. You can see that the text is starting to lighten up and the letters are starting to lose their integrity over here. So Mahar's Torah scroll is quite old, is actually one of the older Torah scrolls I've seen still in use, perhaps because it's not that important to us that we have a really, really kosher Torah scroll. There have been re-inkings of letters, right? So this resh over here does not match. This one does not match this one. So this is somebody coming in later and trying to fix some of the letters. So we have had a lot of words and R's have been re-inked. We also have some words where the parchment has lost enough integrity that they couldn't just re-ink, and the word was actually cut out and a new piece of parchment was glued in behind it, and the word was rewritten. And the scribe who did that did not use the same lettering standard as was in the rest of the scroll, and it really does stick out when you look at the scroll. I just didn't have access. I wasn't close enough in the scroll to pull one of those so you could see how different it looks, but it almost looks like a white sheet of paper was glued in behind it. It's just newer parchment, but it's much newer parchment, and the white is very distinct. So this is, yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were done. I didn't.
No, go ahead.
This is off topic, but in the left most insert on the bottom line, what is that word? On the right, the first word on the last line. It looks like bo man.
Oh, so this is mem komo.
Oh, okay.
Mem, kof, mem, vav. Biblical Hebrew notoriously does not add in enough of the vavs and yuds for you to be able to tell what the vowels are. So you just kind of have to know.
Okay.
But then you can see, so this vav here, this is actually a bad fix in the scroll because this is starting to look like a final nun. Right over here, you can see a final nun. This is getting too long.
Well, who would buy such a Torah? Who would spend their time making these changes that aren't kosher to make?
So I think the scribe thought they were doing a good job. Honestly, I think the scribe thought they were doing a good job, and just there were so many fixes to make in that one pass that they weren't all done very well. And the standards for looking at the stuff have gotten more strict over time too. So this probably seemed okay to somebody, but today this would not be looked at as okay because it's too hard to tell. The standard for knowing whether a letter is made correct, if there's some question, is actually a really strange standard. You're supposed to take a child who has learned their Hebrew alphabet, but is not particularly smart and is not particularly unintelligent. And you're supposed to show them the letter and say, what letter is this? And if they say it's a vav, then it's a vav. And if they say it's a final nun, then it's a final nun. And you have to decide whether you screwed it up. So that is actually the standard I don't have the book, but in the book, over and over and over, show it to a child of reasonable intelligence and see what they say. And so you're really taking like a 7 or 8 year old and saying, what letter is that? And they tell you, and that's how you know.
Sorry if I missed it, but do we know how old our Torah is?
I don't know the age. I definitely would guess that it's well over 100, based on other 100-year-old Torah scrolls I've seen and their coloration. So it is an older scroll. And the work that would be required to really make it kosher again would really be unaffordable. You just want to buy a new one.
There used to be a Jewish bookstore in Wheaton, Maryland, and the man who owned the store with his father was a real expert on fixing Torahs and writing Torahs and rescuing Torahs, which he then, I guess, fixed, and then they sold them to congregations. And he was very good to us as a congregation. He had a very positive relationship, not just with me, but with Rabbi Ben Biber, which was nice, given that we weren't Orthodox. Like he told us once when I was buying the lulav and etrog, he said, "You don't need the kosher one." It's secular. It was like twice the price. But the sad end to the story is he committed fraud. And there was, if you go back and Google it, there was a big court case which he lost, and he's now in prison for these. I guess he said that certain Torahs were from certain places and they maybe weren't.
Yeah, this is becoming a more common story. You'll hear this about Holocaust Torahs in particular.
That's what he was doing, was Menachem in Wheaton. Right. He was selling them to synagogue. He said, "Oh, I went to Czechoslovakia. I found this in the basement. It was all a lie." And I knew him quite well. He sold me a lot of stuff. He was a wonderful person. It was so easy to get. He knew who I was and what it was, and but he ended up rightfully in prison. He was selling Torahs as Holocaust surviving Torahs, which greatly increases their value, of course, their cost.
Yeah, so who else buys a non-kosher Torah? You're going to laugh. I promise you're going to laugh. The Museum of the Bible.
Not surprising.
So have any of you been there? Oh, so first of all, the Museum of the Bible has some incorrect Aramaic on one of its walls, which I was looking at this wall going, this is wrong. It's a nonsense word up on the wall when I think they made a mistake as like an intern did it or something. I don't know. Part of the exhibit is on one of the floors is really sort of not about what's in the text, but the history of the transmission of the text. And so there's an area that has racks upon racks upon racks of pasul, non-kosher, Torah scrolls, rolled up just in rows and in columns. And at least when I was there, this is several years ago, had a sofer, a scribe, who was working on a Torah scroll in the museum. So his desk was there and he was writing the Torah scroll there. And if you happen to be there when he was there, he would answer questions if people asked questions, and you could see him writing the letters. At the Museum of the Bible, there's an article I found online about they paid $100,000 for non-kosher Torah scrolls, like per scroll in some cases. So it's perhaps not surprising that the Green family is the family that, behind Hobby Lobby that spent all this money. They also spent money on fake Dead Sea Scrolls. Not actually very discerning in terms of what they bought. But yes, you can see dozens and dozens and dozens of non-kosher Torah scrolls because they bought them. They're just in racks. It was very strange. So moving from Torah scrolls to Mikvahot. So mikvahs, right, the ritual pools or baths. Mikvahot are subject to rules related to where the water comes from, where the water goes, the material used for construction, the size of the pool, placement within a structure, oversight of its use, and not satisfying those rules can make the mikvah pasul, not kosher, and require remediation. So, for example, you are not going to find a mikvah. You're very rarely going to find a mikvah on the second floor of a building because it needs to be in the ground, because it's supposed to be a flowing source of flowing water on an in and out, and You don't put those on the second floor of buildings. So that's an example, right? If it's too small, can't be used. So there's a lot of stuff about how a mikveh is put together. If the water's from the wrong place, or it's not going to the right place, or it's in the wrong place in the building, or the materials are wrong, or the size is wrong, it doesn't count. It has to hold a certain volume of water. There's a lot of different rules that apply to mikvahot and make them not kosher, make them pasul. So Shabbat and Hanukkah, I know you're not surprised that there are rules in halakha for candles and whatever else, but you're not supposed to use non-kosher animal tallow if you're going to be using candles. Menorahs, there are all kinds of weird rules for menorahs. One of them is that you can actually use a single vessel for oil if you're using an oil menorah, and you can just put in separate wicks. But the rule is you got to be able to tell the wicks apart by looking at them, and if you can't, it's pasul, it's not kosher. There are certain materials that, at least in some regional versions of halakha, Hungary in particular, because they're very, very strict, if it's made of earthenware, it's generally considered not to be kosher as a menorah. So there are actually all of these different rules, and I guess it wouldn't really surprise you to know that there is an entire section of the Talmud called Bameh Madlikin. Bameh Madlikin means with what things can you light, i.e., what are the things you can use to light Shabbat candles, which is also where we get the Hanukkah rules, is from the same section of the Talmud. These are part and parcel of the questions that are asked about candles, that there are rules for whether candles are kosher or not. Are they kosher or are they pasul? What they're made out of is an issue. What the wick is made out of is an issue. How holy thy shofar? No, Holey. Can't use a cattle horn for a shofar. Anybody know why? I mean, the sound is fine. That's not the issue. According to the rabbis, you don't want to remind God about the thing with the golden calf, so don't use cattle horn for a shofar. The integrity of the material. So if the inner parts can slip out of the outer keratin for the horn, you can't use that for a shofar. You make the shofar, you use it for a while, and it develops a crack all the way along one axis. That shofar is no longer kosher, and you can't repair it. If you get a hole in the side of the shofar, if you repair it and it still sounds the same and you use the right materials, you can repair it. Otherwise, it might not be kosher anymore as a shofar. So you don't meet these requirements, guess what? Your shofar is not kosher. So when you go online to buy shofars actually will say sometimes kosher shofar, because they know that there are people out there who are making shofars that don't really meet the requirements for a shofar, often because they're being made by Christians who want to use shofars as like the retro Jewish stuff that a lot of evangelical and fundamentalist Christian groups do. So they have created their own little infrastructure for providing these ritual items themselves. And kosher shofar tells you, oh yeah, somebody was actually following the rules on this.